This video lecture will begin by examining what is known as the Dark Age, the grim period that Greece endured after the collapse of Mycenaean civilization sometime around 1200 BCE. This video will end with a brief overview of Homeric epic, which will have developed by around the time the Dark Age officially comes to an end sometime around 750 BCE. So first, the Dark Age. Again, the Dark Age will last for about 400 years, from 1150 to sometime around 750 BCE. It is important to note, however, that much like the Dark Age, which followed the 5th century collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, things may not have been as dark as was once believed. Indeed, as the timeline on page 47 of your Martin text indicates, some key innovations, like the adoption of a usable alphabet and the use of iron for tools and weapons, were being developed and utilized as early as 900 BCE. The Greeks even managed to hold the first Olympic Games, which required a great deal of planning, logistics, and pan-Hellenic cooperation, sometime around 776 BCE, technically within the parameters of this Dark Age period. So maybe things weren't as dark as was once believed. Nevertheless, the early centuries of the Greek Dark Age were very grim indeed. Thanks to a multitude of archaeological excavations, we can quantify the extent of the devastation left in the wake of the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. In this slide, I've given you some data, and we see that around 1200 BCE, there were about 320 inhabited sites throughout the Greek peninsulas. If you advance the timeline by 100 years to 1100 BCE, we're down to about 130 occupied sites. And if you advance the timeline another 100 years to 1000 BCE, we are down to 40 inhabited sites. So we can assume that there will be a huge dispersal of populations, and certainly a lot of those old palace citadels will no longer be in use. If they are going to be in use, it's going to be by squatters who are not interested in rebuilding anything, just mainly living at a subsistence level. Now, in recent years, archaeologists have revised their estimates as to how quickly post-Mycenaean Greece recovered, and these estimates provide a brighter picture than earlier depictions. One of the trends that we note is that out on the periphery of the Mycenaean world, we see recovery occur much more quickly than the interior. Now, remember, the Mycenaean civilization was centered along this peninsula here, the Peloponnese, where you had three of the main palace citadels located. And this, of course, is the area that will bear the brunt of the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. So it's not really a surprise that the recovery itself, when it does occur, is going to occur out on the periphery of the Mycenaean world. And the areas that I have highlighted in yellow represent those archaeological sites that have been excavated that give us some idea that recovery from the collapse begins really around the year 1000 BCE. We're looking at, from north to south, the area here called Elatea. We have the Lelkandi area on the island of Euboea, and we have on the Attic Peninsula we have the area around Athens itself. And these areas, particularly the Lelkandi on the island of Euboea, I want to take a look at in some detail because they give us an indication that there were some lingering cultural components left over from the Mycenaean period that continued to define life and culture into the Dark Age for many Greek communities. Now, before moving into the specific communities themselves, I want to give you also a broad idea that when the Mycenaean world collapses, you get a vast amount of movement by the various peoples. Some of them are newcomers, and in your Martin text, he will talk about a group called the Dorians, which are believed to have descended from the northern, very northern part of Greece down into the Peloponnese after the Mycenaean civilization had collapsed. And it is these Dorians who, according to legend, actually invaded, and archaeologists in the 19th century into the early 20th century actually believe that it was the Dorians who were responsible for the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. But that does not seem to be the case. Instead, the Dorians moved in when everybody else had moved out and simply occupied the areas of the Peloponnese that had been left vacant when Mycenaean civilization collapsed. So these Dorians, though, will contribute their dialect into as one of the three main linguistic dialects of the Greek language. And the Dorians are represented in my map here in green. That area in green will be inhabited by Dorian speakers. The other two linguistic groups, I'll take the Aeolians first. That is light yellow. Light yellow, and that is based out of the area called Thessaly here and Boeotia here. And in many ways, the most important linguistic dialect, the Ionian dialect, will be represented by the people living on the Attic Peninsula, including the Athenians, the island of Euboea that I've mentioned a moment ago. And this area of coastal Turkey, what is Anatolia, this area will become known as Ionia because of the large numbers of Ionian speakers that will migrate from mainland Greece itself across the Aegean onto the coastal area of Anatolia. And this area here, shaded darker yellow, will be called Ionia. The Dorian speakers, as we see in this bottom text area, the Dorian speakers will be comprised most prominently of Spartans, those people known as Spartans, while as the Ionians will be the Athenians. And I'm setting you guys up for later units when we'll look at the rivalry that will develop between these two great city-states, that of Sparta and that of Athens. So it begins with the dialect distribution during this Dark Age period. So as I mentioned, we are going to be looking at migration across the Aegean into coastal Turkey, into this area called Ionia. And this area called Ionia will, for centuries, be kind of the center of intellectual activity. We're going to get a lot of early scientific exploration, a lot of philosophical exploration coming out of this area, not in mainland Greece, but along coastal Anatolia. And one of the prominent city-states that will emerge is Miletus, but there will be others. So this area will be an extension of the Greek world, and a very important one that we'll explore a little later on. But this migration, again, comes out of this Dark Age period where there is a lot of movement of peoples throughout the broader Greek world. Now, when it comes to units of social organization, as I mentioned, there are no more Mycenaean palaces, and the unit that will be the basic building block for a revised Greek civilization will be the oikos, the household. And what we're looking at here is long structure, kind of a long house, in which an extended family will live, and the eldest male, the father figure, will be the head of the household. And over time, as populations expand, you're going to see these units develop into tribal units, and that again will be the building block for much of the Dark Ages. In our next unit, we'll look at what's called the Archaic Age and the development of what is known as the city-state. But right now we're still at that basic level where family, extended family, and then groupings of like-minded people will evolve into tribal units. So again, very basic when compared to the Mycenaean civilization. Now, that is not to say that you're going to get a flattening out of social organization. There still will remain a social hierarchy. And I mentioned a few slides ago about one of the sites that represents an early recovery from the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. That site is at Lelkandi on the island of Euboea. And it's at this site where we see what you're looking at in the top left image here is one of those long houses that I just described as being kind of the structure used by the oikos. Well, this type of structure was used as also a burial chamber. And within, where I have my circle here, my red circle, within this longhouse structure, we will see two graves. One, I'll begin here on the very right of my slide. There is the burial remains, cremated remains of a male, surrounded by various tomb goods, including a sword, that led us to believe that he indeed was a chieftain, a warrior chieftain, if you will. His body had been cremated, but we know from the bones that it was male. Next to the cremated remains of the male are the remains, not cremated, but the physical remains of a female. And next to these burials, we see three horses that had been sacrificed and buried alongside the male and female remains. And this leads us to believe that this was a type of heroic burial. One of the things that we'll be looking at a little later on in this unit is the epics, Iliad and Odyssey. And in the Iliad in particular, there is a moment where the hero Achilles, in honor of his dead friend Patroclus, will sacrifice animals and human beings in honor of his dead friend. And that is kind of the exemplar of a heroic burial. Well, what we have here at Lelkandi may indicate that there is a lingering social stratification in which clearly there were some chieftains who enjoyed greater status than anybody else in the community, and therefore when they were buried, there is speculation that the woman herself was killed as a kind of honoring of her husband, if indeed that was her husband. So we do get a sense that there is this heroic ideal alive and well in the Dark Age, and that will set us up for what we'll look at in the next section of this Unit 2 lecture, the development of the heroic epics, upon which perhaps this gives us some evidence, the Lelkandi burial gives us some evidence that some of these practices were actually carried out by the Greeks during the Dark Age period. Now, there is another aspect of these heroic burials that we should note, and that is the process by which the memories of these heroes was kept alive. And as I mentioned, because during the Mycenaean period, Linear B was the primary script, and that was very limited, oral composition of epic poems was a part of kind of the entertainment network of even the Mycenaean period. This will continue on through the Dark Ages as even Linear B itself is lost to the Greeks. They will rely heavily on oral composition until after commerce begins picking back up again, and the Greeks will take to the sea and will ultimately be exposed to a broader cultural environment. Now, we see, of course, Greece located here, and over the course of their journeys, the Greeks will settle in Ionia, that coastal part of what is now Turkey, and they will venture even further, and ultimately they will leave the Aegean and sail down into the Mediterranean, where they will be exposed to the Phoenicians, another seagoing people. And the Phoenicians had developed a alphabet, and the Greeks will use this alphabet. They will find it very handy indeed. The Greeks will have to adapt it. They will have to add vowels to it. But ultimately, they will gain the ability to write. And one of the first things that they decide to record via this new tool, this new alphabet, is the epic tales of the great heroes of days gone by. Now, the greatest of these epics is attributed to one poet, Homer. And again, he is credited with creating both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And both of these poems are written down about 725 BCE. Both will consist of 24 books. and 24 books, meaning if we can imagine each book being a roll of papyrus. Nowadays that would be about a chapter for us. So each of the epics is about 24 chapters long, Iliad and Odyssey. And both of these epics will detail the exploits of a heroic figure, or heroic figures, in the case of the Iliad, certainly. So what we see is Homer himself, a lot of controversy surrounding whether or not such a figure existed. I don't want to get into that here. So what we'll look at is, in the Iliad in particular, is the Trojan War era. And this image, of course, you may remember from the Unit 1 lecture, describes or illustrates the broad-based participation of the Greek principalities during the Mycenaean period as they organize under the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, to attack the city of Troy. And of course, the reason given in the Trojan story, the Trojan War story, is that the Prince of Troy, Paris, has grabbed the wife of the king of Sparta, Menelaus, who also happens to be Agamemnon's younger brother, and Paris has taken Helen back to Troy, and the Greeks want her back. Historians believe that if there was a Trojan War, Helen had nothing to do with it. It was an attempt by the Greeks to take the city, pillage it, and control that avenue into the Black Sea, that narrow channel called the Dardanelles. So, but of course, it's a good story, and certainly Homer tells it very well, exploring the heroic deeds of these great figures. And this itself is going to act as a type of code of conduct that will influence generation after generation of young Greeks, particularly those of the nobility, those of a class called the aristoi, a Greek word translating as the best. And the Homeric epics and the code of behavior that they describe is going to offer up a blueprint by which these nobles, who do most of the fighting, to demand for themselves a greater share of political power. And so their warrior behavior gives them legitimacy when they begin demanding more and more political power over their communities. And as we've seen in the last video lecture, the first part of Unit 2, is the tomb at Lelkandi indicates to us that there was a lingering social stratification, in part probably based on warrior ability, if we get a sense of the tomb goods that were recovered. That we do get the sense that there's a heroic ideal alive and well throughout the Dark Age, and Homer's accounts of the Trojan War are based in part largely on generations of oral transmission of deeds that were done by actual warriors throughout the centuries of the Dark Ages. And by the time Homer gets a hold of these stories, he refines them, crafts them, turns them into a coherent epic, and they are written down, if not by Homer, somebody else roughly contemporary with Homer. But again, the point that I want to make to you is they offer up a code of conduct that gives the nobility, the aristoi, a legitimacy in why they are the rulers over the common folk.